So glad to see you all. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm Eve Kahn. I'm a board member of the Victorian Society New York chapter, and thanks to the Victorian Society team for putting on this event and getting everything organized beautifully. Just a couple of housekeeping items. I assume you're all totally all over this. Mute yourself during the talk. And we can come back on. I think we might have controllable enough crowd that we can just do sort of hand raising for the Q&A. And if you don't feel like doing that, I'm sure you're all expert now in putting the Q&A into the chat function. I find it's helpful if people simply put stuff into the chat function as it comes into their head, because yeah, just, it saves you the hassle of trying to remember your question.
Yep.
So really quickly, housekeeping items. We've got one more great Zoom talk coming up this year, December 17th, gorgeously illustrated lecture by the great Emily Orr of Cooper Hewitt on the history of New York department stores. And stay tuned for news of our 2021 roster. Potential topics include the 1890s origin of the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, pioneering 19th century women physicians in New York, enslaved people who escaped to New York as ship stowaways, and the underappreciated splendors of the Audubon Terrace neighborhood. And let every current university student or recent grad tell them that the Victorian Society is soliciting proposals for our Emerging Scholars event next spring. The deadline is March 10th. New York and American topics preferred, but anything that comes into their heads. We've had great wild stuff proposed, and one about hat pins used as tools of self-defense, for example, and gluttony as recommended by 19th century women chefs. So many stories to tell. So it is my honor this evening to introduce our speaker. Katherine Manthorne is on the art history faculty at CUNY's Graduate Center and previously served as director of the Research Center at the Smithsonian's American Art Museum. To better highlight the role of women within the visual culture of the Americas, she has 2 books out this year, Women in the Dark, Female Photographers. It's out from Schiffer. It's a page turner. It's great. Female photographers in the US, 1850 to 1900. And then the star book of our evening, which is the first biography of Eliza Greatorex, one of my idols. And Kathy lives in the Champlain Valley with her husband, James McElhinney, who is a really good trooper, right? Of road trips and support. He's awesome too. And their cat Maeve. And to that very short bio, I just want to add that she's my idol. 8 years ago, because after a conversation with her, I was inspired to write my own book, Forever Seeing New Beauties, a biography of the painter Mary Rogers Williams. And everywhere I go, people know Kathy and they talk about how she inspired them. And there's not just 2 brilliant books in the last year or so. There's a 3rd brilliant book, which is about the history of painting and film. And it's so fascinating. What was John Sloan thinking as he depicted theater goers and moviegoers? So amazing. So yeah, she's my idol. And because of Kathy and her emphasis on making sure that women's stories are told in their own words, the world is a better place. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Kathy Manthorne to the Victorian Society New York stage.
Well, Eve, thank you so much for that incredible introduction. And I'm really excited to be talking to this group who knows so much about women artists and New York and the Victorian era. Sometimes we feel like we have to do a lot of explaining, but I don't think in this case it's going to be necessary. So you can see that I'm just starting here with these 2 images of Ireland. The artist was born Eliza Pratt in the northern part of Ireland in the County Leitrim. And here you can see on the right, she then moved to New York in 1848. So that's where a lot of the story that I'm going to be telling tonight takes place. But to start, Eliza Greatorex was elected to the National Academy of Design in New York in 1869. And some of you may know this was the most prestigious organization for artists in New York and in the country, really. And at the time that she was elected, she was the only female member. So one of the requirements when you were received this honor was that you had to produce either a self-portrait or to commission a portrait of yourself for the National Academy collection. So this is the portrait that she commissioned from Ferdinand Boyle, and it's still in the collection of the National Academy, dated 1869, the year of her election. And I might just mention that Boyle was, like many of the people that she dealt with, from the British Isles, and she tended, I think, to feel comfortable with artists from that background, and so she commissioned him. And we'll be talking about this image, but you can see that she is holding here not the paintbrush that the artists usually hold in their portraits, but this is a quill pen, and we'll see that she shifts from painting to graphic works in the course of her career. So just to point out, there were several women who were nominated or related to the Academy earlier. The image on the left was a work by Margaret Bogardus. She was the first woman elected to the Academy back in the early history. And she was a miniature painter, and this is just one example of her work. But by the time Greatorex was elected, Bogardus was no longer really involved with the Academy, and so Greatorex was the only member. And on the right, I'm showing you a painting I love by Lily Martin Spencer. This is called Kiss Me and You'll Kiss the Lasses. And you can see she's holding a spoon in her hand with the molasses. So the idea is, of course, that she's already tasted the molasses herself. And if you kiss her, you're going to sort of taste them too. So Spencer was very kind of tongue-in-cheek about her images of women, really wonderful pictures. But my point here is that she was only elected an honorary member. She was never actually voted into the membership itself. So Greatorex does have that early honor. So just to point out, I mean, it's extraordinary. I think all of us doing our research, we were chatting before the lecture started, have discovered so many different women who have been largely left out of the histories of art, and but yet in their own day made an extraordinary contribution. And so this is just one of many quotes that I could show you. This is from the prestigious journal, The Art Amateur, in 1845. Greatorex has long been one of the foremost artists of her sex in America, and by her etching has achieved honorable recognition abroad. So in other words, she has an international reputation. And so this, this is just this was partly the start of how I got involved thinking about her and wanting to do something more with her, because it just seems so shocking that one minute she was so well known and now largely forgotten. So just to point out a little bit about her background, she was born Eliza Pratt on Christmas Day, 1819 in Manor, Hamilton. And I'm just showing you here on the map again, the area where she was originally born. Her father, James C. Pratt, you can see on the left, he was a Methodist minister. So at the time, he was a well-educated man, but being with the Methodist ministers, he literally moved every year. They would move all over the northern part. So some of the research I was able to do situated them in many of these different areas throughout the northern part of the country, moving literally year by year. And so I like to think of the idea that she becomes a traveling artist herself. She moves from place to place. She has a very peripatetic existence. And in some way, I think, must have had to do with her early background. She got used to that kind of existence and actually probably thrived on it on some level. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of all the kind of research I did, I've been, I worked on this project for years and years. I don't even want to say how many, but this is just one example of the kind of transatlantic steamers. You can find these records. Of course, now things are more available on, some of the different heredity websites, but this is a cabin passenger list from 1848. So you can see I'm pointing here, James C. Pratt arrived in New York in 1848 from Ireland. So he came over separately from Eliza and his other daughter, Matilda. So there are at least three of them that came in around 1858 into the United States, but their brother, Adam Pratt, had preceded them. So he was living in upstate New York, up near Rochester. So and that's a typical sort of story, I think, with a lot of immigrants, that, the idea that one person sort of establishes a beachhead and then other people come after them. But just to remind you too, of course, that this was the moment of the Great Hunger, the Irish Famine, and I'm just showing you here George Watts's painting of the Irish Famine from 1850 on the left. And then down in the lower right, an image from the popular press that shows the minister visiting the starving people. And again, to remind you, this would have been one of Reverend Pratt's tasks. The family would have been, very involved in the suffering of the people in their father's congregation. So by the time Eliza comes to New York with her sister and her father all around the same time, she's already experienced quite a bit. She's in her 20s, and their father then is retired and coming to the U.S. to escape some of this. So they're of limited financial means, but they managed to come here. And so, you can imagine, and I'm sure many of you know, perhaps even I like to think of this movie, The Gangs of New York, when I see these images, but the famine Irish, of course, came in droves to New York. And many ended up living here in places like the Five Points, which was considered basically the worst slum in the country and probably one of the worst in the entire world in this period. So here are Eliza and her family arriving. How do they cope with this situation? They are not rich. They don't have much money at all, but they're educated and their father's a minister. So they clearly want to find a better situation for themselves. So how do they manage that? That's one of the things I found so interesting. But I did want to also remind you that 1848, they're arriving. This is an incredible moment in American history, right? And so I want to establish right away the parallel between Eliza's career and the women's movement, because here you have, in 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton read the Declaration of Sentiments. So I'm just showing you here, this is again an image from the newspaper on the right, and on the left, this is a document that was prepared on the anniversary of the convention, but showing all the people who actually were known to have attended. So you can see there are quite a few women, of course, but some men as well. So it was an interesting, again, kind of a crazy coincidence that Bennett, who was the head of the New York newspaper, he sort of wasn't very positive at all about the women and all their efforts. So in his newspaper, he actually published the Declaration of Sentiments, their call for women to have these different rights that sort of echoed the Constitution itself. And he thought he was sort of making fun of them and that people would take it in that spirit. But what really happened was that being in his newspapers, this document got a huge amount of traction and press. And so people were very aware of what had happened there. And some of you probably know that Frederick Douglass and other people spoke there as well. And so Eliza then is arriving in New York at this moment, but not only that, they're living with her brother initially in the Rochester area. So they're near this area. So while I've not really found a direct link that she was physically there, but certainly these ideas were in the air, and she will, over the course of her career, be very involved with Susan B. Anthony, her friend, and others. So anyway, by 1849, she meets Henry Greatorex, who was a musician, a composer, and he actually came from a very distinguished family. His father is buried in Westminster in England. He was a very famous composer and mathematician, but Henry came to the United States, marries Eliza Greatorex, and I love this image on the right. It's not really a portrait of him, but it's sort of a conceptual portrait. Self-portrait. He was a member of the sketch club that had been founded by Thomas Cole. And so when you went to the sketch club meetings, they would announce the theme for the night, like it could be spring or it could be all kinds of things. And then this particular night, it was happiness. So you can see that Henry has actually done this image of himself as a musician playing his instrument, because to him, this is the great idea of happiness. So he pursues his career as a musician, and Eliza pursues hers as a visual artist, which was rather unusual at the time. And here I'm just showing you on the right, this is apparently Eliza wrote these words, this poem, Love Me, and Henry put it to music. And they published it. You can see she's done the images, and then they published it, the music, which became a kind of popular song during the Civil War. So I like to think that although Henry was a very dreamy kind of guy who never had any head for finances at all, apparently, Eliza was a little bit more practical. And so she published their love poem. Anyway, so Henry knows the sort of Hartford crowd. He had been an organist at the church in Hartford, and so he knows people like Cole and Goodman and Daniel Wadsworth and all these different people in Hartford. So when Thomas Cole died in 1848, again, that key year when Eliza arrives in New York, then they soon put together a big memorial exhibition. And so again, I don't have all the links firmly attached, but I like to think that they would have been aware of this event, and that she would have certainly begun to be interested in Cole's landscape painting. So here I'm just showing you this image on the left of this beautiful daguerreotype by Matthew Brady from 1845. And then the same year, Cole's painting of Catskill Creek. So Eliza's coming from Ireland. She wasn't a rich girl at all, but apparently her father's people did help educate her for a while, because she clearly came to the States with some kind of ability as an artist and a sense of culture. So by 1863, this is the kind of landscape painting that she's doing. This is landscape near Cragsmoor up in the Hudson Valley area. And this has recently been acquired by the Rockwell Museum in Corning, New York. So I'm really happy that finally some of these works are being acquired by museums, by public museums where people can see them, as well as the private collectors who have them, because I think it's important to establish these kind of outposts where people can see her work, and as well as some of the other artists, women artists, and be able to really appreciate them, but also just to become more familiar with their style and their work. So William Hart was one of her early teachers. We know that she came here, she started to, get involved with the sort of art scene. She was also going to the sketch club where Henry was, that I mentioned. And so that's one of the places where she could, meet writers, meet other artists, and, get together and sketch on a regular basis. But she also needed further instruction. And so William Hart was one of the ones that she worked with. And here you can see his work on the left. And again, I'm just showing you that work of the Cragsmoor area on the right. But I love this painting because this is Julia Hart Beers. This is the sister of William Hart, who got married, and so her name is Beers. But she too is a landscape painter. Many of the people in the Hart family were landscape painters, and so this is one of the works that, again, she did in the 1860s. She and Eliza were friends. They were both widows. And so they're both living in New York. And again, to think about the idea of where do women find studios? How do they cope with the same kinds of pressures that the men are experiencing? So we know that there were a couple of dedicated buildings in New York already by the 1850s and 60s where artists could have studios. And so both Julia Hart Beers and Greatorex were in the same building, not the 10th Street Studio, which was kind of the main headquarters for a lot of the well-known men in the Hudson River School, but they were in a building called the Dodsworth, which was another very respectable building. And so they would have had the opportunity to, as one of the journalists at the time said, she wanted to find a place where her children could feel comfortable and she could work. So at this point, she has 4 children. Eliza does. Beers has 2. And so you can see that, again, sometimes the little details in these landscapes, we tend to overlook them. But if you look more closely, you can see this is actually a woman on the path with a little child beside her. I mean, 99% of the time, you see the figures of men. So I like to, again, think of these 2 women, traveling up and down the Hudson, sketching out of doors, back to the studio, doing their work all the time, trying to sort of mind their children too. It must have been a bit of camaraderie that they felt together. so this, this whole idea of the female network, I think is very important. And it starts to get more and more complex and supportive. And this is just another character in the mix. Her name is Elizabeth Elliot. And she wrote several different books about, women in the American Revolution. She's excavating history to find the women's roles. And this is the first real art history book about women artists, as you can see, in all ages and countries. This was published in 1859, so this is pretty early. And she actually has a whole entry on Eliza Greatorex and her landscape paintings. So you begin to start to get, a bit of a network. And authors like this, because she had written several other books that were, kind of important history books, and she was a well-known figure, this book too got attention, and people, would have looked at it and used it so that when subsequent writers come along and are writing about American art history at the time, they look back to her and include people like Greatorex. So anyway, Henry passes away in 1858, leaving her with 4 children and limited financial means. So these are her 2 daughters, both of whom became artists as well. Kathleen is at the top. You can see her date's 1851, but she lives into the, late into the time of World War II. It's kind of, so she saw quite a bit of change. And her sister Eleanor was younger, but and died earlier. So you can see these 2, both of whom have their bodies of work spread out around them, were pretty serious artists too. She had 2 sons, but I've never located any pictures of them. So these 3 women, the 2 daughters and the mother, traveled and worked together for all of the life, the entire time that their mother was working and on, living. So anyway, I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of some of her travels. And then I wanted to focus a little bit more on her work in New York City, because I figured that this is the Victorian Society of New York, so you might be a bit more interested in that. But just to give you a little bit of an idea, in 1861, a couple years after Henry passes away, Eliza leaves her children in the care of her sister and heads off to Europe. I think she felt very strongly that if she was going to be able to support her family, she needed to upgrade her style, so to speak, to to spend some time in Barbizon and to work on her landscape, the kind of landscape she was doing. So here on the left, I'm just showing you, this is a work by Winslow Homer, and it just shows, people at the time would go to the Louvre, to the museum, and one of the activities that, helped train an artist's eye was to copy other paintings. So here you can see these women are all engaged in copying these paintings. And sometimes too, they would be hired by people back home to make copies that they would hang in their homes. So it was partly a way of supporting yourself and partly a way of training yourself. And here on the right, this is a work, The Wash Day at Chevreuse, outside of Paris in the forest. And you can see the little motif of the kettle boiling, and these women are doing their laundry. So already her style is kind of taking on this a bit of European touch. So it's kind of amalgam of some of the things that were going on in the Hudson River School back in the United States and France. And this was a style that does become popular in the US at the time. So then she goes home again. The Civil War is raging, but by 1870, she's back on the road. She goes to Germany between 1870 and 1872. So she had this idea. She wants to start doing pen and ink drawings and to illustrate them in books. And at the time, Germany, and especially Munich and in Bavaria, I should say, was really the center of the working with this idea of art reproduction and high quality printing. So she goes there to learn how to do this. But in the meantime, she discovers that the Oberammergau plays, the Passion plays, were going on. They had been postponed because of the Franco-Prussian War. So she goes to Oberammergau, and here you can see on the right, this is an image of the, just arriving there. on the left, this is just a photograph that I took of the area. And so in each one of her images, you can see this mountain peak, the Kopfel, which is kind of a genius locus for the place. And of course, this characteristic architecture. So the Passion Play is going on all summer. So she writes to her, she tells her children, okay, we're going to stay here. I want to absorb this pious atmosphere and the spirituality of the people that I feel here. But she doesn't ever depict the Passion Play. Many artists were there from all over Europe and the United States. Many people did reproductions of the play sets and the players, but she is interested in the domestic setting, the houses. So she and her children live with a family in the town. This is the house they live in. And she does images of all the different houses in the town that she puts together in a book. And here I'm just showing you, if you've ever been to the Passion Plays or to Oberammergau, it's kind of amazing. All the houses have this Luftmalerei, this outdoor fresco painting on them. But you can see that she doesn't actually show the frescoes on her building. So I'm not exactly sure why, if it was just because she felt that it gave a more rustic look to leave it the way she did, or she gives no explanation for that. But anyway, here she is in Bavaria for 3 years. Then, while they're still in Bavaria, they're already writing, well, what are we going to do next summer when we go back and publish the book? What's next? So she goes to Colorado, the next summer of '73, she goes to Colorado. And here I am on the left, going to, we pretty much, my husband, James McElhenney, and I pretty much went everywhere that Eliza went, sort of checking out the places and comparing her images to the actual motifs. So this is Monument Valley, again, an amazing place, but completely different from Oberammergau. And here you can see just some of the anthropomorphic drawings that she does of these different rock structures there, which are really astounding. So she spent a summer there and produced another book, Summer Etchings in Colorado. So these are small scale books that, you could hold them in your lap. And this is just an image on the right that I'm showing you. That they took the Transcontinental Railroad out to Colorado, Eliza and her 2 daughters. The railroad had just been completed in 1869. So they're, kind of pioneers heading out there. And once they get there, it's amazing. They're climbing the mountains. Somebody else took her down into the mines. And she talks about the fact that, well, we had to wear our dresses, because we had to look respectable. So when they were climbing the mountains and things, she talks about the fact that tying her skirt up in her belt, sticking the umbrella that she needed to shield her drawings when she was drawing in her belt, and scrambling up the mountain. So, this is an adventure. And so these are the kinds of images that she creates for this book, with a narrative about her travels. And then in the 1880s, they're traveling all over Europe, and they also went to Morocco. And here I'm just showing you on the left, this is an image by Eliza's daughter, Eleanor, kind of wonderful watercolor of the Moroccan market. And on the right, they also went to Mont Saint-Michel. And this is Eliza's, she's working on plein air etchings now. She's given up just the pen and ink, and she actually takes these small plates with her, small etching plates, and creates these images. And, they toured the whole mount, which again, for, a woman who's past 65 by that point, at that point in time, it was just a new experience to go out to Mont Saint-Michel. They had built a little causeway, and so it was quite an experience for them to visit all these different places and create these images. But for the rest of the time, I did want to talk to you about post-Civil War New York, because when she gets back from her one of her trips to France, she realizes that, Paris is undergoing the changes that Baron Haussmann is instituting there, knocking down all the old medieval buildings and the earlier structures, and creating these wide boulevards and a more uniform architecture. And then she gets back to New York, and she starts seeing similar things going on. This is one painting from 1868, and you can see scaffolding on the buildings. People are removing the debris. There, this huge change going on, the urban renewal, so to speak, of this post-Civil War era, making room for new modern buildings, making Broadway wider and extending the full length of the island of Manhattan. all these things are going on. But Eliza's looking around and she's seeing that these beautiful buildings that are so, treasured historical objects are being destroyed. And so she begins to formulate a plan to actually record them in her pen and ink drawings. So this is the moment where this 10-year project sort of is born. And this is just a more literal kind of image from the Harper's Weekly showing the march of improvement. So you can see, again, the building in the background, 1876, is being torn down, more scaffolding. Those of us who live in New York, it's endless scaffolding, right? Old trees are being torn down. But you can see no one seems to care. Everyone's just chatting. They're all just paying attention to each other. And only this one elderly gentleman is trying to point to what's going on here. So I like to think in a way that he's a kind of surrogate for Eliza Greatorex, because this is also her mission to try to awaken people to this great loss. So this is just the detail from the portrait that I showed you before by Boyle. With her portfolio that she's leaning on and her pen and ink drawing. So what happens is, she gets news of a particular building. She reads it in the newspaper, or someone lets her know that such and such a building is being torn down. The wrecking crews are showing up. And she would take her pen and ink with her and her sketchbook and set her stool up in front of these different buildings and actually record them. And so in some cases, we don't have very many other records of some of these buildings except her drawings. So it's really kind of a remarkable project. So you can see that these are just a few examples. Ultimately, she'll probably do about 100 or so of these different, different structures from around the time of the Civil War, 1865 through 1875, when she finishes the book. So this is just one example that I like to show because it's so completely, it ties into the kind of frustration and anxiety that she must have felt. This I'm showing you here on the right is James Renwick's church, the Church of the Puritans. And you can see this is Union Square, and we're looking down towards the tip of down to the Battery. So you can see Lower Manhattan is very crowded, and you have this beautiful structure that was, by all accounts, a very handsome and wonderful church. Well, Tiffany and Company had been further downtown, and they decided that they really wanted to be up here on this more fashionable square that isn't so crowded. And so it was actually reported that this church that had been built just in the 1840s was an architectural masterpiece, was being torn down in order to construct the new Tiffany store. So Eliza goes and draws it. Here you can see this image in the middle. But the other thing I wanted to point out is that it's not just an architectural, many of these buildings that she's recording are not just architectural, significant works, but they're also historical. And this church, the Church of the Puritans, was actually the site of the Equal Rights Association conference in May of 1867. So some of the speakers were the same as those who had been at the 1848 Seneca Falls. Here you can see Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and now I wanted to also point out Sojourner Truth. She was an abolitionist. I mean, she was a slave. She got her freedom, and then she went around lecturing to different groups about women's rights and abolition. And I don't know if you can see too well on this particular card. This is a small carte, what's so-called carte visite photograph, this one here, which is only like 2.5 by 4 inches. But she had these pictures made, and she would sell them wherever she went, wherever she lectured. And you can see at the bottom it says, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." So these women are all, very active. We know Greatorex was friendly with a number of these different women. And so this church must have had almost a double significance in terms of its destruction. I wanted to just show you one more church that she's recording. This is the North Dutch Church. And I'm comparing her drawing on the right to one of her friends, Edward Lamson Henry. He depicted it in oil paint on the left. This painting on the left is in the Metropolitan. So just take a minute to compare these two. You can see that he's showing the streetcars, the horse-drawn kind of carriage here, lots of activity on the street. where she has the whole church kind of encased in this skein of trees. So as you'll notice, as I'm showing you some of these different images, she tends to do this. She tends to sort of emphasize the vegetation. She tends to ignore or to pick a viewpoint where she can not include things like the more modern transportation or other different references. And just from, I mean, a lot of this I talk about in the book in much more detail, but just to give you the short version, it seems as though she's thinking about these stand of trees almost like a curtain that we would sort of push aside, and this is the access to a past time, that she's thinking about the history of this building and not just its contemporary moment before it's about to be torn down. And then this I wanted to show because Eve, this is located at 76th Street and West End Avenue, which is near where Eve lives. So this is the Summer and Dyke House, which was on what they called at that time the Bloomingdale Road, which is now Broadway. So again, you can see, you know, now you're getting the idea of the kinds of things she does, right? She has the old house. She takes a vantage point that allows her to show it in a more kind of picturesque and rustic way. You can see this one's done in 1868. And then she adds some more details. And one of the things she mentions is that Louis Philippe had inhabited this place and taught school here. So this was a myth that's, I find it's just so interesting. Louis Philippe later becomes the King of France, right? But he and his brother had about a 2-year period where they were living in the United States and traveling around the United States. So there's this story that gets told and retold that he actually had to work as a teacher in New York in order to support himself while he was here. And it seems as though New Yorkers love this story somehow, that even the person who becomes the King of France, you know, is a poor immigrant who has to teach. There's no real evidence for this. He and his brother did travel around the country, but they didn't spend very much time in New York. Actually, they spend a lot more time in Philadelphia. And there doesn't seem to be much indication that they were school teachers. But for some reason, the story keeps getting told. So when Greatorex does the book, her sister writes a text. Each picture is accompanied with several pages of text about the history of the structure and so on. And so they tell the story, and you know, it keeps getting repeated. And you can see that in this case now, this is actually a lithograph that somebody did a sort of imaginative recreation of Louis Philippe teaching here. So it's just, again, the kind of things that they were, the stories they were telling about the buildings. They would also interview the current residents, get information about their ancestors who lived there when it was first built. So it is kind of almost partly an oral history, you know, sitting down with these people, chatting with them, getting the information. But here I just wanted to show you the same image one more time, the Summer and Dyke House on the Bloomingdale Road, and to compare it to another image from that same book, Valentina's Manual, that had the image of Louis Philippe. And now, what do you see here? That's, again, Greatorex totally ignores. You can see the telegraph poles and the telegraph wires, and actually even light fixtures, gas lights along the road, and actually a road that has, you know, some kind of surface that's actually been smoothed out, all of which Greatorex ignores. So this idea of her sort of casting the buildings in the past, telling their story, and trying to preserve them almost as a kind of relic of the past, I think is, you know, part of the idea of her book. And just to show you again, I mean, she's not totally fantasizing this. Up the Upper West Side, the northern part of Manhattan, right around the time of the Civil War, was rural and agricultural. So as the post-Civil War economy is demanding, you know, more and more space for business and residences, they begin to more and more invade this northern part of the island. But when Greatorex first got there, she's wandering around these places. It's almost like the countryside, you know, so it's sort of extraordinary. But here I'm just showing you. So ultimately, she puts all these different images of her buildings into this book called Old New York, which was sold, as most books were in this time, in installments. So you would buy like part 1, part 2, and then when you got them all, you would have them bound in, you can have Moroccan leather, you could have different types of kind of book bindings, but here you can see this is Old New York, and this is a larger volume than the other two, 14 inches long. And here's the cover. She calls it Old New York from the Battery to Bloomingdale. So she's literally taking people on a journey and showing them, look, all the different places that once were and were, mostly lost. And then I'm just showing you I love the lettering. They do the cobwebs. Some of these things I think were done actually by her daughter, Eleanor. But here you can see the cobwebs and the eagle, the American eagle. And of course, this couple wandering along, embracing each other. So the idea is right from the beginning, they're signaling the reader that this book contains personal and romanticized histories. It's not meant to be like a literal compendium of New York. It has this other side to it. And of course, at the time, the whole idea of the romantic historians was still, a common motif for history writing. But just to show you that you can imagine yourself sitting there with this large book. You would have to have it on a table or something, and turning the pages, and you can see that each image, there's an image accompanied by some kind of text that explains it, which was written by her sister, Matilda Pratt Despard. Her sister's last name was Despard. She had married into a family that, if anyone is familiar with that name, was actually a great Irish rebel. So one more house that I just wanted to have some fun with here. You can see that this is the Beekman Mansion on the right that Greatorex depicts. And this was built by James Beekman, whose portrait is shown on the left, done 1764. And then again, in the text, Greatorex and her sister would emphasize, it was built in this early, in the colonial period. It lasted all this time, and it's demolished in 1874. So for her, even just a phrase like that tiny bit of information would, filled her with outrage, and she would have thought that her readers or her viewers would have felt the same way. This is New York history. New York is destroying its own history and doesn't even care. Think of a woman who comes from Ireland, and they had a very different sense of history. They wouldn't have the same kind of rapacious changing of architecture and constant rebuilding of the city was quite foreign to her. But I just wanted to show you that this, the Beekman place this was where this house was located, the Beekman Mansion, and this is just a photograph from 1938, because you can see it's before that the highway was built along here. So it gives you a little bit better idea of where it was located. And here you can see it's just the map. It's way over on the east side at 49th Street. So this, just imagine her, and she talks about this in her book, traversing the island, walking around the island city, visiting these different spots and spending time in each one. And if possible, spending time trying to track down descendants or people who knew those who had lived in the building or who had some idea about their building's history, because a lot of these buildings hadn't really been treated in that way. That we didn't have full histories of them. But anyway, in the text, Eliza and her sister call this perhaps the most interesting of the houses connected with the revolutionary history. And once more, I'm showing you a work from Sarani's book, the Valentine's Manual, that was lithographed by Sarani. And you can see here, the life of the family is quite elegant. The mother is sitting here, there are paintings on the wall. And of course, they have the African-American servant who was at that time probably a slave. So this is a famous place. There's lots of interest in it. There are lots of different discussions about it. And Greatorex is, again, recording this place that's about to be destroyed. And just one more comparison from Mary Louise Booth's book, The History of New York. Mary Louise Booth was probably Greatorex's best friend. And I don't know if that name is familiar to people, but probably her last name would be Booth. Her cousins were John Wilkes Booth and Edwin Booth, the actor. So, she comes from that family, but she herself was the founding editor of Harper's Bazaar. So when Mr. Harper hired Mary Louise Booth, he figured, okay, we just want a sort of a women's lifestyle magazine, you know, show them some nice clothes and how to decorate their home. And Mary Louise Booth managed to turn that journal into something that really had strong messages for women about women's rights, about employment. She also employed large numbers of women in the magazine. So this was Greatorex's closest friend in New York. And so the two of them share this great interest in history. So Greatorex is doing her book, doing these images of the lost buildings, and Mary Louise Booth writes this whole sort of synthetic history of New York. And by the third edition, she actually works with Greatorex to get some of to illustrate the book and include some of works by Greatorex. But here you can see this is the Beekman house in that book. Again, it's close to Eliza, but takes a very different point of view. And Beekman, when it was the residence of Sir William Howe during the Revolutionary War, the British actually confiscated it and were in residence there. But you can see that, you know, there were many of these kind of bucolic images of this house with this beautiful stagecoach pulling up, and it was actually called Mount Pleasant. So just imagine, you know, when New York was like this, and this is around, you know, 49th or 50th Street, and it's so idyllic and beautiful, looking out to the river here. But again, this was a kind of fascinating way that they approached this. I mentioned before that they were sort of doing oral histories. They were talking to the residents, people who occupied the house at the time it was about to be torn down. They would interview neighbors. So that was the oral history part of it. But they were also doing material culture. So they actually looked at the tile work that and some of the different objects in the house and talked about this as well. And so when the building was torn down, when the mansion was torn down, some of these objects ended up in the New York Historical Society. So I'm just, again, showing them to you to give you the sense of the grandeur of some of these colonial houses and, you know, the tragedy and the frustration that Greatorex and others felt that they were being just torn down without any real, you know, conscience about it at all. So here you can see the fireplace and then the coat of arms up above, and I'm just showing you the detail of the coat of arms. You can still see these in the New York Historical Society. And then on the next slide, I just wanted to show you, these are close-ups of a couple of these tiles that are called the Dutch scripture tiles that had been removed from their fireplace. And so again, this, you know, the kind of slice of history that these houses represent, where, you know, that itself, I think, a kind of fascinating, you know, that it's not just the grand stories of you know, famous men, but that they're trying to argue that these houses have stories to tell and reasons to be preserved. And so this too was part of her agenda, almost proto-preservationist. I don't think she had any great illusions that she was really going to stop you know, urban development in New York or anything of that nature, but she certainly wanted to capture what was being lost and also to make people aware of it and maybe even to make them feel guilty about it a bit and try to stop some of it. So 76, 77, the mansion was occupied by the British Commander-in-Chief, William Howe. And so later, and here you can see Howe on the left, and on the right, this is, again, this was a famous place. This is a painting by Ferris. I'm just showing you a graphic after it. Depicting these different people, Peggy Shipton, who was Benedict Arnold's wife, being greeted by General Howe. All this is going on at this house. So during the colonial revival, people are creating these, you know, kind of fantasy scenes or imaginary recreations of the kinds of events that went on there. So this, again, Greatorex ties into these histories. And, you know, she talked about the idea that she wished that these houses could be, at least one or two of these houses could become museums, places where relics like the tiles and the chimney piece, and this sign, this was the sign from Mount Pleasant in 1786, could be preserved so that people could, you know, enjoy their history and begin to really have a sense of what it was like to live in New York in that period. So, I wanted to just end. This is the furthest, the northernmost point that she went. This is the Morris Jumel Mansion, and one of the few structures that she actually depicted that are still standing. So you can see this is the house as it looks today, and this is, she actually took the viewpoint down the hill looking up, and also, of course, made the river look a little bit closer than it was. But, you know, I like to think that she would have been so happy to know that this house is actually a museum now, and preserving some of the things that she was so, you know, she was so adamant should be taken care of and understood. So I thank you for your attention, and you can follow the further adventures of Eliza Greatorex in my new book. And I just have to say that I'm very grateful to the University of California Press for getting it out during the pandemic, because you know, I know a lot of authors who whose books didn't have that lucky fate. So I think we can't take any of these things for granted. So thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely riveting. I love her story. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much. That was amazing. I have a million questions, but as people gather their thoughts for the chat. So she has 4 kids. One of them is Henry's kid, right?
Right. Henry had been married before he met her,
Yeah.
to another woman who died, I think, shortly after childbirth. So that was Francis. His name was Francis Greatorex, and so she took him in, and then they had 3 children together. So and so that was her brood.
Right. So she's farming, and we love her. I just want to say, I want to start up by saying I love her, but she has family members who help raise these kids while she's trying to earn a living, right? On the road.
Well, her sister and her brother, you know, both seem to be pretty, you know, supportive of her, and but she also helped them too. So I mean, when she decides to go to Paris, her sister is living in Cornwall on Hudson, up the river, and so she takes the Greatorex children, and she has her own children, so they're all kind of playing and enjoying themselves together. And then later, when she goes to Germany, when Greatorex goes to Germany, her sister goes with her, and they bring all their kids with them too. You know, they have this idea that they should all learn German, and and they can live a more cultured life. And so, you know, so they were. It was I think I like to think of it as almost like the a guild or a workshop. You know, that they all work together. And her daughters too. You know, sometimes they would add details on some of her books, or you know, like her sister writes the text for Old New York. And then I found one copy of the Colorado book that she actually inscribed to her sister, and says, you know, to my best editor and friend, and you know, this book never would have happened without you. So you know, clearly it's a family that sticks together and helps each other, but to all their mutual advantage, because I think Matilda, you know, had aspirations to be a writer. She, you know, did publish a few things, but nothing got as much attention as Old New York and the things that she wrote with or about her sister. So, you know, it's kind of, it was I would like to think of it as, you know, a kind of symbiotic relationship. They got along, you know, they were supporting each other. It wasn't, you know, that one person was the weak link or something.
Right. It was a family company, a family business. Yes. Laura asks did she train at any Irish schools before she came to the States?
It's so frustrating. I wasn't able to find that much information about her life in Ireland, and so a lot of it was really supposition. But one of the things that Matilda did write was this kind of semi-autobiographical book called Kilrogan Cottage. So, you know, it's sort of, it's cast as a fiction, but it just happens to be, you know, the children and the father's a minister, and they're living in Ireland and all, and I think the main character's name is Elizabeth, not Eliza. But anyway, I sort of took a little bit of what happened in that book as background, but also the fact that her father's people were, you know, not rich, but they were educated, they were cultured. And so when he went off to become this itinerant minister, I don't think they were overly thrilled with that idea. But I suspect that that Eliza must have gone back and lived with her father's people for a while, because by the time she gets to the United States, she's thinking of either being a writer or an artist. I mean, how could that be possible if she didn't have some some more exposure to culture than just on her father's like itinerant ministry route? So I think that something like that must have happened, but I haven't been able to really I was never able to nail that down.
Yeah. So Francis lives to his 50s, right? The oldest son lives to his 50s. The two daughters never leave Eliza's side, right? And then the other son gets killed, right?
Yeah, that was horrible. Yeah.
Right, when he's in Colorado? I can't remember the story.
Yeah, he's in, so yes, so the son, he was kind of the bright light of the family. He's very handsome. He's very, he had lived for a while with his uncle, Adam Pratt, who has worked for the government during the Civil War. He was in the Treasury Department. So I was able to find a few different references in the Washington papers to the fact that the son is actually working in the government and already making a name for himself in the Treasury Department. But then he decides to go out to Colorado, probably because the whole family is getting excited about this. And he goes out there and he becomes like a surveyor. And their stories are that, again, he's very cultured. I found a few examples where he did illustrations of landscape for travel books and things like that, early travel books about Colorado. And he's also singing in the choir and things like that. So he's clearly, again, an educated, cultured person. And one night, I guess, this woman was being hassled in one of these, he lived in this very like pioneer town, and he stepped in to assist her, and this thug murdered him. So he shot him, and the son, lives for a few days between life and death, and then dies. So the way I was able to find out, it was this I hardly found any letters, but there was one letter that Matilda wrote to her sister when she was in Morocco, saying that I have to tell you this terrible news that your son has been murdered in Colorado. And so it was just, then the family came home and they were just in mourning for about a year. So it was very sad, because he seemed like, such a successful, reports in the newspaper in Colorado talked about him as though, they loved him there and they barely knew him. So I can only imagine how his own family felt.
And since this is the Victorian Society, can you describe what the two daughters did at the Dakota, or what we know and don't know about their work at the Dakota?
Yeah, that's another mystery. So in the 1880s, they come back from Europe, and they're living for a while again in New York, and Eliza's doing so the Dakota building is being built, and Eliza's doing images of the outside of the building and the surrounding area. And the two daughters have some kind of commission to paint decorative murals in the Dakota. So I was able to find some descriptions of them. They actually did these types of flowers and things that grew out in Colorado. So they were, so it wasn't like a mural with a historic theme. It was more floral decoration. And from the descriptions, it sounds like it was on the first floor, there were public rooms at that time. Now, I guess it's different, but there were, public rooms, and this was kind of called the ladies' sitting room. And they did these murals that were described in the press at the time. And I think the reason it must have happened was because this man Clark had the Clark family had been the ones who were sort of behind building the Dakotas. The father died and the son kind of before the Dakota was finished, and the son took over. But they had been friends with Eliza, and the Clarks were the ones who bought a lot of the material at one of the auctions that ended up in the Museum of the City of New York. So I can only assume that that it was because of these connections with the builder of the building, or the financer of the building, that that they got this commission. But at the time it was saying, oh, the Greatorex sisters are up on the scaffold and they're doing these images, and I was never able to really find out more or get any kind of access or records other than just what was in the press.
And are they connected to the Pratt Institute, right?
I think just distantly, but I mean, it's tricky because there's some of these names, like, I mean, I was lucky in a way because with the name Greatorex, it's not very common. So if you found it, it most likely had something to do with her. But when I tried to track down Pratt descendants and things like that, I mean, it's a nightmare. There's so many Pratts.
Yes.
So, but I did find a few references that seemed like there was some kind of connection, but very, very remote.
And Roberta asks if Eliza painted the slums or shanty towns. And I'm curious, did she paint African-American neighborhoods, or did she seem to take a stance on different immigrant groups or ethnic groups, as far as you can tell?
It's a little tricky. I mean, her brother was amazing. I mean, he was a huge supporter of the African-American community. One of the places that I found the most information about him was in the records of Howard University, which is an all-Black college, because he gave a lot of money to them. So, the Adam definitely took this idea of civic responsibility and religious, mixed with his own religious background as a Methodist, and he was very active that way. I wasn't able to find as much that Eliza did, but with him, but I assume that she shared those sentiments. But she had 4 children, and her situation was very different from her brother's. She did do some of the shanties that were in Central Park and in the area around the Dakotas, while her daughters were painting. I mean, they were sort of all set up working there and did some of the cabins and things like that. But for the most part, she was more concerned with this idea of the historical, establishing this historical record. And I think, some of the buildings like that wouldn't have really come to her attention necessarily, or been so thought of as something that should be recorded. I guess that's part of the issue. I don't know. It's always tricky to find information about things like that. But she also was very active in the Irish community. The Irish people with Irish background in New York. And I mentioned that her sister married into the Despard family, which was a family of very important Irish leaders and rebels. And another one of her close supporters and friends was this man named Emmett, who gave a lot of his collection to the New York Public Library. He collected a lot of resources about images of New York. And so if you just look on the New York Public Library site, if you put in Emmett, a gazillion things will come up. He was a huge, and he also came from another Irish family who was very active in the early Irish movement, and so their friends, a lot of their friends had this kind of background. And in the book, I didn't show it here, but the only monument that she actually references in her book is the Emmett monument, which is at the Trinity Church. So she's sort of, I like to think of this idea that so much of the history of New York up to this point, when she was working, was focused on the Knickerbockers and the Dutch background, and she's kind of slowly inserting, or this idea of the Irish background, and but also raising their profile, because at the time, I mean, the Irish were considered really to be not very welcome in the city at all, shall we say, right? There was that sense during the draft riots, they were blamed for a lot of the violence, and so they were really put at the bottom of the totem pole in terms of the social hierarchy at the time. And so she's again trying to elevate that status, and trying to associate with many of her the people who came from the same country she did, and trying to show their contributions.
And so, just to end on a poetic note, she was a wanderer, right? Oh, I think you told me only one of her homes survives, and it's in France. Is that right? or one of the family
Right, yeah.
who survives, right? She never stopped wandering, right?
Yeah, they were always on the go. I mean, there was no, there was really, I mean, they did keep their U.S. citizenship. You know, I was able to find that the daughters would periodically come back and to the U.S. wherever they were and renew their citizenship. So they seemed to have that, you know, want to keep that link. But at the same time, yeah, they were always moving around. And towards the end of Eliza's life, the daughters ended up getting this place in Moray-sur-Long, which is in the Barbizon area, and so it was a very kind of rustic place that we were able to track down. And I assume some of the time Eliza spent there, but still they were constantly going all over the place. You know, they went to Norway. I mean, just extraordinary energy and curiosity. I mean, her sister said something like, you know, at the end of some project, you know, she says something like, you would think that she would slow down, but I know that she's already thinking about the next project and she's always wanting to learn more and more. So, you know, you think about some of the male artists at the time, you know, like, I mean, I love Frederick Church or Albert Bierstadt, but they continue to do the same thing for most of their careers, right? The same kind of pictures, we can associate them with certain things, but Eliza reinvents herself over 3 times. She starts out as a Hudson River painter, then she does her graphic work of old New York, and then she's not content with that. She rushes off to learn plein air etching and does a whole other body of work. So, you know, you have to kind of admire her spunk, shall we, as my grandmother would say, right?
And it's London, it's the continent, it's all around Europe, right?
Yeah, and I mean, yeah, I didn't really get to talk about it much. I just showed the one image, but they go to Morocco, and you know, for women to go to Morocco by themselves in that period, again, wasn't very common. And one of their friends was recording something about their experiences, because of course they're always running around and they never record their own experiences. But one of their friends said something like, well, they mentioned that if someone had been murdered in their house just before they moved in, but they didn't seem troubled by that. Yeah. So you can't keep
it's so fascinating that these wanderers, that she had this sense of loss in New York. It absolutely fascinates me. She moved constantly as a kid and as an adult, and yet there was this sense of the loss of sense of place. As she watched 18th century, she rushed over to watch buildings being demolished as if these were her childhood homes, right?
And even, I mean, the fact that when she goes to Oberammergau and everybody and their brother are, you know, they're all recording the Passion Play and the players and all the different, you know, things that are going on related to the actual, you know, this sacred performance that's so famous, right? She's depicting the houses that the people, you know, the townspeople live in. You know, she becomes fascinated with this idea that all these people are, you know, the townspeople are taking care of all the tourists. They're, you know, people are staying in the local people's houses, but at the same time, every day they're getting dressed and going off to the theater and playing Christ or Judas or whatever. And, you know, and so then she does their houses. So, you know, there is that, you know, that sense of, that the home is important, you know, a constant search for something, at the same time that she doesn't seem that interested in really putting down roots herself.
So I'm going to take one last question. Jeremy asks if the Mount Pleasant plaque, was it copied from a nameplate or made up, or?
No,
Is it made up of figures? It's made up of little people and their legs, right? I can't quite make it out, right?
I have the name of I mean, it's signed here. Let me see. I can, if Jeremy wants to contact me,
Okay.
I can, my email is Kathy, Kathie.Manthorne@gmail. Because I had the name of the person who did the sign, and now some reason I took it off the label.
Okay.
Off the slide.
Yes.
But yes, it is ascribed, and but it was the name of, you know, that's what the Beekman named the house Mount Pleasant. Let's see. You can see, like, it's here, it says Mount Pleasant. It was.
Oh, right. Yeah, yeah. Kathy, I'm so grateful, so fascinating. What an amazing evening, transporting and heartbreaking, and yeah, what an amazing character you've brought to life, an amazing family you've brought to life, and the work that's involved, the numbers of trips and the numbers of wisps of letters that you've tracked down. As I said in the beginning, you're my idol, Kathy. Absolutely amazing. Thank you everyone for coming. And now the comments are pouring in. Amazing, fabulous, brilliant. brilliant, wonderful. So thank you so much, and have a good evening, everybody, and have safe holidays, and we'll see you in January. Thank you so much.